Hi, everyone. I'm Lucy Beard. I'm the co-president of the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites, and welcome to our March Women's History Month program. The Collaborative's mission is to advocate for historic sites that center, excuse me, I have a cold, that center the preservation and interpretation of the important role of women and gender nonconforming individuals as core to the American story. We are a volunteer organization governed by a board of directors who come from every section of the country. Since we began 22 years ago, we have partnered with other national organizations on meaningful projects that shine a spotlight on American women's history. We've worked with the National Park Service and successfully nominated 4 new national historic landmarks that honor women. They include Navajo leader Annie Dodge Winika's Klagetoh Chapter House, standing within the Navajo Nation in Arizona, the Durham, North Carolina home of theologian, lawyer, and activist Pauli Murray, the Lynn, Massachusetts home of Mary Baker Eddy, founder of the Church of Christian Science, and the Coconut Grove, Florida home of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas, who saved the Everglades from development. Our most recent and huge project has been the creation of the National Votes for Women Trail to commemorate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which legalized women's right to vote. The trail is an online database of more than 2,400 sites across the country where suffrage activism can be documented. It might be a park in downtown Newark or a church in Santa Fe. All the places that tell the grassroots story of the suffrage movement. We have also have an actual trail of historic roadside markers in 45 of the 50 states that document further parts of the trail. The online database is a work in progress. We are adding sites as more research is done and we find them. This evening, our speaker is Erica Ciallela. She is the Belle da Costa Greene Fellow at the Morgan Library and Museum in New York City. She has a background in women's history sites, including the Prudence Crandall Museum in Connecticut. And she's been an archives assistant at Wesleyan University and a special project assistant at both. She is now a member we're very happy that she's now a member of the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites Board, and she's here tonight to discuss Belle da Costa Greene. As I said, I'm asking you to mute while she is speaking. She's going to share her screen. And if you have questions, please type them in the chat and we'll do our best to get to them when she's finished speaking. So Erica, take it away.
All right. Thank you. And we are going to hopefully share the screen correctly, which is always the fun part. So we're going to.
Bingo, you did it.
Oh, where'd it go? Now I need to play it. All right, there we go. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for coming tonight to this talk where we're going to talk about one of my favorite people who I've had the opportunity to pretty much do nothing but study for the last 2 years of my life, Belle da Costa Greene, and I title it The Librarian's Legacy. And so I'm sure most of you are here tonight by your knowledge about Belle Greene comes from the book, The Personal Librarian, which has been, we've found at the Morgan, everyone who comes through our doors has read this book or knows of this book, and that's what is drawing them to Belle Greene's story. But a lot of people ask, like, okay, what, is that the full story? Is that everything about Belle Greene? And that is a work of historical fiction. So the authors of the book, who are amazing, wonderful people, got to tell a story they wanted to tell that doesn't include all of the historical facts. So tonight I'm going to share, the historical facts as we know them today, because history and research is always ongoing. So every day we learn something new. But as of tonight, this is the most we know about Belle Greene and her story. And a lot of it is through her own words, through a lot of archival work that has been done, not just by me at the Morgan, but by the head of my department, Philip Palmer, and who's one of the lead curators on our upcoming exhibition, which will be in October 2024. That will be a 2-gallery expansive show about the life of Belle Greene, which I've had the pleasure of working on, as well as other colleagues at the Morgan who've just done amazing work, bringing everything we know about her to light. And so I'm just starting with this wonderful photo of Belle Greene that is currently at the Princeton University Art Museum, and possibly my favorite quote ever of hers. She's writing to a sports writer who is giving a lecture at the Morgan, and she says she doesn't dote on libraries, but she does on this one, meaning the Morgan, and she'd very much like to show him through it. And that's just a wonderful statement, because we know she loved all libraries, not just the Morgan. So it's just kind of already I'm beginning to show you her wit, which was just absolutely amazing. And I don't think any of us in talks can really do her humor and her language and her voice any justice, because she is just a powerful, unique, wonderful woman. But we're gonna take it all the way back. We're gonna go back before Greene to kind of set the stage of where did this woman come from and how did she get to the Morgan Library. So this on what you're seeing now is a map of Washington, D.C., circa early mid 1860s, 1870s. And this is where Greene's mother, Genevieve Ida Fleet, was born. And I love starting with her mother because she is just an amazing woman that unfortunately we have no pictures of. We keep hoping that someday we will find one, or somebody we can't see the name written on the side of it, but as of right now, we don't know of a picture where she's been identified in. But we've been lucky enough, me and the head of my department got to go to James H. Fleet, the residence, which is Genevieve's father, in Washington, D.C., in the Georgetown section. So you're looking at the door of the very home where Genevieve Ida Fleet was born, in Georgetown in Washington, D.C., and we have an 1860 census that lists her and her family. The Fleet family of DC was a prominent family in Washington, DC in the 1860s, and even previously. Genevieve's father, James H. Fleet, was a musician, a teacher. He actually started 2 schools in Washington, D.C., and he was even trained to become a doctor by the American Colonization Society. They paid for his education in Georgetown. However, they never granted his degree because him and 2 fellow students complained that they were not, as African-American students, getting the same education as the white students. The American Colonization Society also had a requirement that if they paid for this degree, that they wanted James H. Fleet and the 2 other men to go to Liberia and practice medicine there. And James, it was like, I'm not going. What are you talking about? I live here. My family's there. I want to practice medicine here. So he does not finish. They do not grant him his degree despite finishing that medical degree. But so it was a trained doctor, had all the training, but he goes on to become this prominent musician instead, and runs a music store. Like I said, he opens 2 schools, and a number of Genevieve's siblings are actually named after famous composers. I don't know if you can really see it on the screen, but you have Mozart, there's a Mendelssohn, there's Bellini, which I just think is so wonderful. But we can already see this this movement towards the classics and the literature and the education that is coming from the Fleet family. And then on the other side, Greene's father is Richard T. Greener, who many people know as the first African-American to graduate from Harvard College. It was called Harvard College then, today Harvard University. You'll see his diploma on the screen. The middle image is his actual yearbook photo, which the Morgan does hold that yearbook. And then we have in that yearbook also is a photo, not a class photo, I'm sorry, a photo of one of the clubs that Greener was in. It's very hard to see where he is. He's sitting on the steps to my right hand. There's a gentleman there's lots of top hats. He's not wearing a top hat, but he's one of the gentlemen wearing the lighter coats sitting on the steps. But so Richard T. Greener is a fascinating gentleman just throughout all of the work he did. He himself was a librarian at the University of South Carolina during Reconstruction. He was a lawyer, an activist, diplomat. He served many posts throughout his life. So these is the kind of the two parents of our Belle Greene that we'll be talking about for the most of the rest of this conversation. But I'm going to place them in Washington, D.C. So what a huge part of their life in Washington, D.C. was the 15th Street Presbyterian Church, which we do know is where Richard T. Greener and Genevieve Ida Fleet will get married. Genevieve, this pamphlet is from the Library of Congress. Genevieve's name is listed as one of the women of the church working on this event that they were holding. And in the middle of the screen, we have a photo of their minister, who is Francis Grimke, who will be the minister who baptizes all of the Greener children at this church. And he is known as being the nephew of the Grimke sisters out of Philadelphia, who are well-known abolitionists. And there's been a new work by the scholar Kaylin Greenridge called The Grimkes, which really dives into the history of the family. And her work has been really informative because it has allowed us to really dive into the background of this church. And I've gone to see the records, and it's really fascinating because this was one of the elite churches in Washington, D.C. in the 1860s and the 1870s. At the time, their records show that people such as Elizabeth Keckley, Mary Todd Lincoln's seamstress, was a member of this church. Many of the Reconstruction African-American senators from the South were members of this church, such as Blanche K. Bruce. We know his daughter got married at this church. And so this was a really, wealthy, high-class church. But there was also a lot of conversation at the time about them, because when Grimke came in, there was a membership. In order to get in to be a member of the church, you had to sit in front of a select board. And there are newspaper articles at the time complaining that they were being colorist. They were only accepting new members who were of lighter skin, and they believed that this was the way to do some racial uplift work, which has not really been explored when you talk about the Grimke family or the church. But it leads us to begin that conversation of this was the mentality that Genevieve and Richard T. Greener were living in. And so how did that form their thinking as we move through the years? Did that have any influence later on in life when Genevieve does choose to pass as white, which we will discuss in a little while, as quickly as I can to not keep us here all night. But so this church and this minister, Grimke, really play a formative role in that conversation of how did the Greeners view religion? How did they view race? This building, right, which was the church until it burned down. So this, how did that influence their life? And like I said, the children were raised in this church. So who are these children? Well, so we do have a copy of, or an image of Belle Greene's birth certificate from the DC archives. They were nice enough to share with us. She was born November 26, 1879. And she is the second child, or the third child, I'm sorry. First is Louisa, then there's Russell Lowell, then there's Belle, and after that, there'll be Theodora. And so I do want to quickly mention that Belle Greene's birth certificate is first made public in a 1999 article by the author Jean Strauss, who was actually working on an amazing biography of J.P. Morgan. And when she was doing this biography, her research was like, well, Greene is such a huge figure in the Morgan Library. I don't know anything about her. Let me go explore. And she starts really digging, and she's like, well, I'm going to go look for a birth certificate. And she's the one who was like, hey, wait a minute. Her father's Richard T. Greener? She's listed as colored on her birth certificate? Oh my gosh, we didn't realize this information. So she's the first one to publish this information. And up until that time, the Morgan really didn't have any idea until that information came to light. So it was really astounding discovery. And, since then, more and more people such as Heidi Artizone, who wrote the only biography that's out there right now called An Illuminated Life, to continue doing that work on researching who Belle Greene is. And that's the work we continue today. So like I said, she's born in 1879, and we have this census here from 1880 that shows that the family is living in T Street in Washington, D.C., which is about 2 blocks from Howard. It's actually Howard University, where Richard T. Greener will work at the law school. It's a really quick walk. I did it. It's not too bad. And so we see the family, and the first set of boxes you'll see on your screen is actually Genevieve's brothers. And his family is living right next door to the Greener family. Then you see Richard T. Greener and all of the children. Like I said, Theodora is not born yet, so she is not mentioned on this. And then you go back to Mozart Fleet, so another one of Genevieve's brother living in the same area. And I'm just going to point out that in 1880, we have a census where the family is listed as white. Census records are very interesting documents because we don't always know how the information got into the census. There are recorded instances where census takers would go to a neighborhood, see that it was a white neighborhood, and record everyone was white, even if there was a Black family living within that community, if they were light enough. So this does not mean that, you know, they came to the door and Richard answered and said we're white. We don't know that. Censuses have to be taken with a grain of salt because of that, but it does speak to the neighborhood they lived in and the amount of wealth that would have been in that neighborhood, where a census taker would have assumed that someone was white or could have been white in that neighborhood, which just, it's a very complex conversation and interesting, and we are still trying to figure it all out and understand it fully. So in the late 1880s, Richard T. Greener will take a position working on the Grant Monument Project that will become Grant's tomb in Riverside Park in New York City, which is still on the west side of Manhattan today. And so he will move to New York City to work on this memorial for Ulysses S. Grant. He will actually meet J.P. Morgan at the first meeting of the Grant's Tomb Project. They have one meeting for about 5 minutes when JP is like, yes, you can use my bank for this project. And that is the amount of time they spend together. The rest of the Greener family won't move to New York City until till 1887. Sorry, I had to move my screen to see the date I wrote on there. And so this isn't the street that they lived on when they first moved to New York City. So they were on 58th Street between 8th and 9th, and the family will move around a little bit throughout their time in New York City. And so, oops, sorry, I'm going the wrong way on my slides. So in 1887, the family moves. There's already problems, though, unfortunately, between Richard and Genevieve, and they start to separate. And by 1894, Genevieve and Richard are divorced, and he has taken a diplomatic position in Vladivostok, Russia. And in one of the letters to his cousin Isaiah Ware, he talks about the divorce and says, the only child who's written me is Louisa. She's doing well in school, but I'm not financially tied to the children anymore, so I'm done. And so he will kind of leave the family, and we don't have after that any recorded instances of him contacting the family ever again. But where does that leave Genevieve and her children? We do know they move to a different couple of addresses in New York City, and then it's time for, Greene finishes her lower level education. And then what's next for her? Well, she actually gets to go to Northfield, which today it's called Northfield Mount Herman School, but back then it was just Northfield Academy in Massachusetts. And that's through the philanthropist Grace Dodge will pay for her education. We're not sure how the family meets Grace Dodge, but Grace Dodge is known to have supported educational endeavors of people. And so Greene goes here, and this research was done by a colleague of mine, Daria Rose Farner, who really dug into the Northfield archives and brought all of this education to light, which we didn't know for a long time. So it was really amazing to be able to find this, especially this is her application to the school where she lists she wants to be fit to be a librarian. I don't know what it means to be fit to be a librarian. I think it's a great language and really fun. But so it's really wonderful. But also, I'm going to point out that at the top of the application, we do have her name is still Marion Greener. And I point that out because we have name changes that will come very quickly in the late 1890s, early 1900s, that kind of begin to show the changing dynamics, or how Genevieve is going to work, how the family is going to operate without Richard T. Greener in their lives anymore. And so this is 1896. She goes to the school, and very shortly after, we'll start seeing that they'll drop the R from their name, and they'll just be Greene. And then eventually Genevieve will become Genevieve Van Vliet. And that's when we begin to see, okay, maybe she's passing. And eventually the Belle Greene and her brother Russell will adopt the da Costa. Louisa and Theodora, the two other sisters, will just leave it as Greene as their name. So after Greene goes to Northfield for kind of higher education, she'll attend the Amherst College Summer School, excuse me, in 1900. And this is where she gets her library education. And so the large photo is the entire class, and some, it's always a fun game, like, can you find Belle Greene in the back? But I've pulled her out. We have this close-up crop of her. She's all the way kind of in the back, in the ivy, just kind of with this look on her face, like, can you see me? That is just wonderful. And this photo is the earliest known photo of Belle Greene at the age of 21. And the Amherst College just shared this with us like a couple months ago, not even. So this is really new, just that they shared with us. So it's really amazing to have this earliest known photo. And to be able to also see the other people that she went to library school with. But a lot of people always ask, where did she get her library education? Well, here it is. In early 1900, we're seeing the professionalization of the field in a very new way. We're seeing a lot more women enter the field at this time. And it also, but still, women working in special collections was not as rare. Many of these women will go on to work in public libraries. So Greene is still kind of one of the few that's going to work her way in a different direction. And she does that by going to work at Princeton University. And so Greene will go to work in Princeton University around 1902, 1903. Princeton's records don't have much. There's like one record where they say, where she's listed as a cataloger at the Chancellor Greene Library, which is the photo on your screen of the building, which is still there today. It's actually getting construction work done on it right now. But so that is the library that she worked in. And we have a 1905 census that places her in Princeton, and it says she's doing library work. Like I was saying about the names before, we do see that the names really start, the Van Vliet and the Costas come around 1903, around the same time that Greene is moving to work at Princeton, as well as her brother is going to Columbia's engineering school. So the name changes might be affiliated with these education centers that the children are going to. Was it just easier for them to put them in there to kind of, make it inconspicuous? We don't know. Unfortunately, we don't have answers to all these things. But that's around when the name changes are at the same time she starts to work at Princeton. And like I said, she was doing cataloging work, and that's where she'll meet Junius Spencer Morgan. This is just a wonderful photo of him from the collection of Elizabeth Morgan, who's a family member. And so she meets Junius, who has this amazing Virgil collection. And he is like, I'm helping my uncle, who's creating a library, a personal library of his own. And he needs a librarian to catalog it. And I think you might be perfect. And so in late 1904 is when Junius will introduce Greene, who's still going back to New York on the weekends to see her family, to J.P. Morgan. And so, oops, sorry, wrong screen. I obviously don't know how to use slide points. I'm sorry. And so that's when she'll meet J.P. Morgan. And by 1905, she is working for the banker J.P. Morgan. But we're going to I constantly go in and out of backtrack, and to kind of before we go into talking about the Morgan we're going to talk a little bit about New York City, and also the conversation around why would somebody like Belle Greene need to or want to pass in New York City in the early 1900s, because we're not in the South. What would be the necessities for that, kind of what would set that up? And so this image of Belle Greene here is from 1910. It was what we used to think was the earliest known photo of her until we got the Amherst College photo. And so New York City in the early 1900s, while yes, is racial tensions. There's a large riot in 1905 in the Tenderloin district, which was only about a 10-minute walk from the Morgan Library, or where J.P. Morgan's home was and where he built his library. It was that close. There was this huge race riot in 1905 that really shook the city to its core. And it actually, the Tenderloin district will get destroyed and teared down, and is what is now Penn Station in New York City. So the city is not this safe haven. And as we move throughout this early period, we know that in 1917, there is a protest by the NAACP down Fifth Avenue, blocks away from where Morgan built his library. That was a silent parade done by the NAACP in order to raise awareness about the lynchings in the South. And then when you start moving into the Harlem Renaissance, you have writers like Nella Larson, who's pictured on the screen with her book, Passing, who really start to delve into the race question and what is passing, why would people pass, what is this social construct that everybody's talking about, how does it affect their lives? You have individuals like Nella Larson, Jean Toomer, County Cullen, who are not only writing about these in their work, literature work, but they're talking about it very explicitly. The writer Jean Toomer, who was biracial, when he was put into a Negro anthology, was like, don't put me there. I want to be seen for my work and not just my race. And this is a lot, it seems to be, with Greene leaving no archive whatsoever. We have no writings from Belle da Costa Greene on race, on her family, on her thoughts about her father. There's nothing that exists. We do know that she burned around 10 diaries when she died. And she does write to the art historian Bernard Berenson. I write in these diaries the things I dare not say. Like, she said something like, I dare not speak out loud. I dare not tell anybody else. So these are thoughts she didn't even tell one of her closest confidants, Bernard Berenson. And so we cannot say what her thoughts were. We can only operate in the world we know she operated in. And so by looking at figures like Nella Larson, like Jean Toomer, and their experiences, we kind of formulate, okay, could she have thought this? Could she have been this way? You know, and that's all we unfortunately have to go on, which is very difficult, because I know people want answers. They want to understand her thought process, but we can't put words in her mouth, unfortunately. All we do have is the words she did leave behind, which does give us a lot about her biggest passion of all, which was the Morgan Library and books and literature and art. Books and literature are the same thing. Illuminated manuscripts and art and all of these amazing things, which she wrote about with a huge swath of correspondence that is housed at the Morgan today, as well as institutions worldwide, because she corresponded with that many people, and as well as 600 letters to the art historian Bernard Berenson. So while we don't have these intimate thoughts of her that I know are so intriguing, we have so much more that we can go on. I keep hitting the wrong button. I apologize for that. So we're gonna come back to, all right, she starts at the Morgan. And so she starts in 1905. And we have this great quote from Junius to his wife, Josephine Perry Morgan, where he's writing to Josephine, who did know Greene from when she was working at Princeton, about how she started working for Morgan, and she's actually not at the library yet because it's not finished being built. So she's at the Lenox Library branch of the NYPL, where the collection's being housed, and she's doing all this cataloging work. And I love that he says she's having the time of her life, which, I mean, it's not shocking that she was having the time of her life. It was already a huge collection that she was cataloging and working with, and it only grew extensively once she's able to come on and really start purchasing for the institution. So this is just some early photos of the Morgan Library as Greene would have known them. The East Room of the library is kind of the like awe room. It's so beautiful. It's so amazing. And in the early days of the library, this would have been, you know, where Morgan would have entertained individuals who were looking at collection items, or if he wasn't there, Greene would bring them in to show them some of Mr. Morgan's treasures. And then on the other picture is of the North Room, which was Greene's office from 1905, when it was finished construction, or around 1906, to her retirement in 1948. I'm going to preface this that this image is very neat and tidy. She's notoriously messy. It would not have ever looked like this when she was working in it. This was a photo shoot that was done for a magazine spread, so she cleaned up her office that day. But in the background, I don't know if you can tell, there is a photo of J.P. Morgan sitting, and it's the Steichen photo of J.P. Morgan, which was one of her favorites. And that was really there. That was not staged for that photo shoot. And so talking about this amazing collections that she is entrusted with and her early acquisitions, I just have on the screen two of her early acquisitions at the Morgan. One is a Poe manuscript that she actually we have a great quote to Morgan about why she feels like it's so important for his collection. And we have this quote in here that's one of these famous ones where she says she aims to make the library preeminent. And boy, does she ever really do that. She accomplishes that tenfold. But it also has how, like, the dealer wanted her to pay $2,500, and she's like, I'm not paying that. I'm going to pay $1,500. Greene is very quickly known for her negotiating skills, and she is amazing at haggling any dealer. And she is like, will not pay more for a book than she thinks it is worth, which I am sure the Morgans very much appreciated. And then on the bottom of the screen, we have one of the William Caxtons she bought, and she actually negotiated the sale of 17 Caxtons from the Lord Amherst sale. And this was a really big acquisition that she made. And again, the negotiating skills that she had as a woman in the early 1900s, dealing in a male-dominated world. I mean, all of these book dealers, all of these auction houses, they were men. And she's all dealing with a lot of money. These works were not going for like $50, we're talking thousands of dollars at that time, which today would be a lot more than that. And she had no fear. If she didn't let it on. She didn't even let it on in her letters. She just went in blazing and just overtook them all. And they very, very, like, within a year of her being there, everyone trusted her thoughts. And so that just is such a statement to who she was as an individual. On the screen, in the personal librarian, they do talk about this acquisition, which was her kind of landmark, oh my gosh, acquisition. It is one of the William Caxtons. It's the only complete copy of I always say it wrong, so I apologize. It's the King Arthur tale. And this was the huge acquisition at the time. All the papers talked about it. You can see we have a copy of one of the papers there. It says $50,000 for that book. We actually spent $49,800 on it. And this is the acquisition in 1911 that put Belle Greene on the map. After this point, you couldn't talk about the library. It wouldn't just be about J.P. Morgan anymore. It was always J.P. Morgan and Belle Greene. Every article that came out would be like J.P. Morgan's collection. And then there's always a part of the passage that's like stewarded or, managed by, or anything about Belle Greene. You couldn't separate her from the library immediately, almost within a few years of her being head of that collection. Around this early time in her life, she will also meet the art historian, which I kind of already brought up, Bernard Berenson. Him and his wife, Mary Berenson, will visit the Morgan in 1909, and this is where her and Berenson's relationship will start. This is their actual first letter on the screen here, and I just want to mention that hopefully within a year, the 600 letters that are currently housed at I Tatti in Italy, which was Berenson's home, currently managed by Harvard University, there will be a website with all the 600 letters on them. And I believe at least the first 100 transcribed, because as you can see on the screen, her handwriting is not the best when she's writing to Berenson. It's very loose, very free, because she loved him. So it was just like, all right, I can just write my thoughts to him. So they immediately form a close bond. They do have a romantic relationship, but they actually only see each other in person maybe 4 or 5 times, but they do have a correspondence for her entire life. So from 1909 until her death in 1950, she will correspond with Bernard Berenson. And these letters are just a treasure trove of like, if you want to know early 1900s art dealer gossip, this is where you go. They talk about everybody, who's doing what, who's selling what, who has the face, who has the best stuff. It's actually just really interesting. And I didn't know anything about it before I started working at the Morgan. So be on the lookout for that website when it comes out. But so they do have this amazing relationship where he also just kind of helps her with different, you know, giving her thoughts on different acquisitions, pointing her to different scholars that she might want to reach out to find out about other acquisitions. So this relationship is really both a romantic one, but even more so the deep, unabiding friendship that really develops around their shared love of books is just beautiful and wonderful. And she has it her whole life. Sadly, in 1913, this is a huge transition point for Belle Greene. She'll lose J.P. Morgan when he dies abroad while he's actually, he had just come back. He was on a trip to Egypt and then was in Rome, and then he passes away. And this is a letter that she writes to Bernard Berenson about the death of J.P. Morgan. And you'll see this letter has this black border on it, and that's the Morgan's mourning stationery. And she'll actually use the mourning stationery for at least a year after J.P. Morgan's death. And this is the famous Steichen photo of him on the screen that I said was in her office. That was one of her favorite photos. And this death really hit her hard, but it was also, what does that mean for her? You know, what's going to happen to the library? What's going to happen to her job? She stays at the Morgan, obviously. We have this newspaper article from 1913 that she is going to continue the work stewarding this collection of the Morgans. The entire library will transfer to his son, who is also J.P. Morgan Jr., but we just call him Jack, and that's how I'll refer to him throughout the rest of this because it's just easier to separate Pierpont and Jack. And so Jack takes the helm, and it's a conversation, though, of what is going to happen. And he does sell off some of Morgan's famous paintings at this time, his Chinese porcelains, a coin collection. So there is a lot of movement, and Greene is in charge, tasked with inventorying everything that is at the Morgan in New York City, as well as Pierpont Morgan's home in London at Prince's Gate. So she's in charge of handling his entire inventory, and it takes a number of years. The estate isn't fully settled till around 1918. So it is a large work to do. But then what is going to happen? Well, Jack, who is seen in this portrait here, this is actually one of Greene's favorite photos of Jack Morgan. This is taken later in his life, 1920, or later, 1929, not 1913. But Jack Morgan wants to honor his father's wishes. And his father's wish was that for at some point, his collection to be given to the people. And so in 1924, Jack, with Greene by his side to steward this collection, gifts the collection and the McKim Library. McKim was the architect for the famous library, to the city of New York, making it a public institution in 1924. Public does not mean the same as public as in like NYPL, which I say that because it's really funny in our archives, the number of letters we got from people thinking they could just come in and borrow a work. Like, you can't come in and borrow the Gutenberg, sorry, like you can't take it home with you. But that's what people didn't understand when it was public. It didn't mean that it was the same as a public library. So those are really kind of funny letters that we got to read. But so in 1924, we go public, and she becomes the director of what is officially named the Pierpont Morgan Library at that time. And in 1928, we open the annex, which used to be Pierpont Morgan's home, gets converted into the annex, gets torn down and rebuilt into the annex building that is still our gallery space today. And so these are just two images. One is of the entrance into what became the reading room. And then the other was what became our exhibition space. And then the McKim Library, our original library, still housed Greene's office, Jack's office, which used to be Pierpont's office, which was the restroom. And then the East Room in all its glory was still there and still used for private viewings of special collections where Jack could bring in, the royalty that came to visit, diplomats, all those kind of visitors would get to go into there. And we were still using a vault within our West Room at this time. So that's where all the collections were kept. And through all of this, Greene is still doing her job as a director through all of this tumultuous, like losing Pierpont, becoming a public institution. She's still acquiring things and developing as a librarian, as a director. And so this is one of her acquisitions, the Eugene Grandin, that was made in 1925. But what's amazing about this one is that we do have this wonderful quote that she writes in a letter to Bernard Berenson, where she talks kind of about her curatorial practice and why she acquires what she acquires. And she talks about the fact that she doesn't want to buy a first draft of, like, she doesn't want to buy a printed version of a book. She wants the first draft. She wants to see the growth of the ideas. And if you can, it's not as clear in the image. It's so much better in person, but like the amount of writing and scratched out in this manuscript, she loved seeing the creative process, and that really influenced a lot of her purchases. We have an amazing manuscript collection that is similar to this one here, where you really get to see an author's thinking through their work and that creative process. Our drawing center today, the number of drawings that are, first drafts, or you see the process and they're not that final copy, because Greene was so concerned with how does an artist get to that final copy? How do we see that process unfold? What can that tell for future research, for future creatives? And it's such an interesting mindset that she had on this at a time when this wasn't really thought about. And so to be able to have this quote about this manuscript and really understand how she thought about the collections is just really amazing and wonderful. And as a librarian, I really much geek out about it a lot. And then these are two other really amazing acquisitions. Greene was a medievalist. Her bread and butter was our medieval illuminated collection. That's what she was best at knowing, her knowledge base was on. So we have two of our most famous acquisitions on the screen. I butchered the name of one of the Biotis, which is the 798, the MSM 644 here, the double-laid spread. The spread, it's just these gorgeous illuminated manuscripts. And then we have Old Testament miniatures. I don't know if you see the guy who's kind of hanging off the edge of the catapult on the side of it. Is just so fun. But so the collections of medieval illuminated manuscripts she collected is astounding. Throughout her career, she collected around 200 of them, which doesn't sound like a lot, but when you think about the cost of illuminated manuscripts, none of these were going for less than $1,000 at that time. And so that money, like you figure with inflation, it's a lot more than that. So these are really expensive works, and to have collected that much throughout her career is really astounding. She will collect Rembrandts. We have the largest collection of Rembrandts in North America, and that was directly related to Greene acquiring them and really looking for the best states of them that she could. Me and my archives brain, I have to share the archival documents with you, because we have so many things that teach us about how Greene was as a director, and learning that kind of, thought process she had, much like that quote tells us her collecting process. I'm just going to point out her paycheck, which you might be like, why are you showing me her paycheck? So that paycheck was for $833 a month. That equated to about $246,000 a year. In 1921, she was making, she was one of the highest paid women in the United States. There were newspaper articles done about how much she was getting paid at the Morgan. And she really commanded a high salary. We always joke that if librarians only got paid that today, how wonderful would that be? But she was also a female director at a time where that was not a thing. You didn't have female directors of these institutions at this time. She was really living in a man's world. They called it a bookman's world. Like that was what she was living in. And she was accepted by them. They didn't question her knowledge base in any way, shape, or form. And so it is just really astounding. And she advocated for higher pay for women librarians in public libraries. She really advocated for the profession of the field. She said, like women shouldn't go to work if they're just gonna, dilly-dally. Which I don't know if I agree with that statement of hers, but she was really like, we need you, if you want to come into this field, you have to have a passion and a drive and want to be in it, and you should be compensated. for that work, and she really believed it. And the Morgan, actually, we were able to do some checking, was one of the highest paying staffs at the time compared to institutions that were similar, like the Met or the Frick at the time. She would write them and be like, what are you paying this position? And then pay ours more. She was really advocating for our staff, and she was a huge mentor. She believed in training the next generation, which brings me to the middle letter, which is a letter from Dorothy Miner to Belle Greene. As you can see, it says, "Dear BG." Dorothy Miner would work at the Morgan only for a year before Greene gets her a position at the Walters Art Gallery in Baltimore, Maryland, where Miner will have a career it's like over 30, 40 years. She will spend her entire career, the rest of her career, at the Walters as the head of their medieval illuminated manuscripts. But we have so many letters between Belle Greene and Dorothy Miner where Dorothy's asking questions like, oh, should I ask for this much money? How should I do this? And Greene responding like, oh, do this. Let me show you how to do that. Let me come down and help you with this. Really training her, being that mentor for her. And this is not the only person that Greene did this with. She would do it with our own librarian, Meta Harson, who would do her whole career at the Morgan and actually take on the role of curator of illuminated manuscripts when Greene retires in 1948. She does this with another employee, Helen Frank, who she trained, Violet Burney. We have all of these amazing women that Greene brought in who had a passion for the collection. She was very strict when she hired and said, you need to be as dedicated as I am. And if you do, I will give you, all of the knowledge. And she did. And I mean, she trusted staff to make acquisitions when she wasn't there. She trusted them to be with the visitors, do the reading room. And she was just one of them. She would take a reading room shift along with them. So she really was integral to the staff, and it was a family. And last, the part of her director like this trifecta of things she did was Greene was really a forefront in access and education when it comes to special collections. This is a newspaper article where it was shocking that we were using our medieval manuscripts as textbooks. We would just kind of let the students from different classes come in and literally work with the books, which today we're like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? Wait, handle that a little bit better, please. But she really believed in the collections being used. They weren't to be there just to look at, just to be pretty, just to put on exhibition. They were to be used, they were to be studied, they were meant to be, used by the scholars, by the students. And she's famous. She has a quote to the director of the Huntington in California one time where she says, students shouldn't have to travel east or west and incur that cost. I'm going to send you copies of our manuscripts. You send me yours. And really understood, like, students can't do that. They can't afford to do that. How do we make it as accessible for them? And so that is such a forward thinking at this time. Today, we're just like, oh, digitize everything. Okay. But she was already thinking that in the 1920s. And it's just amazing and wonderful that she did this work. And then I love this photo of Greene from 1929, but there's a great, this quote from when an NYPL library school instructor is asking her to give a talk, and Greene's like, I don't give lectures. I don't do that. Just come in, I'll give you a talk. And then we know that all the thank yous that came in after this talk were just so amazing, and the students had the best time. But there's also this humbleness in Greene where she's like, don't see me as an expert. Don't see, let me just bring you in and show you what I love, which is kind of, as you can see, I talk the same way. I can't really just do it all like, here we go. So Greene really, she knew who she was and she knew what she did best. And that was a benefit to the Morgan and to the collection, and only grew not only its physical collection, but the amount of scholars that got to use it, how they viewed it. We have letters talking about our reading room as being a sanctuary and being just one of the best in the world where they can come and interact with these materials. And it's something that was really new at the time and innovative that she pioneered, that she really, the Morgans gave her the money and the reins and said, okay, go, we trust you. And she took it and went and turned it into this amazing institution. On the outside of the Morgan, which she didn't spend a lot of time outside of the Morgan, she was always there. Greene has like two really interesting civic works that I'm just going to share with you as quickly as I can because I'm probably talking too long. The photo here is is from the Library of Congress, and it's Greene, Alice Carpenter, Kathy Davis, and Maud Wetmore. And this is actually an event. Greene worked on the political campaign for Hughes, who was running against Woodrow Wilson in 1916. And this is really interesting because Hughes was a huge advocate for suffrage, and that he actually had women across the country that did like a train campaign for him, crossing the country, campaigning for him because he supported women's suffrage. He supported equal rights. He was very much a forward-thinking individual. Unfortunately, he loses to Woodrow Wilson, which sucks. And we know that Greene was not a fan of Woodrow Wilson, especially after the 1919 peace treaty in Europe. She writes a letter where she's like, I can't show my face in Europe after what Wilson did. So she is not a fan of Wilson. Not surprising, especially knowing her background. But so the fact that Greene worked on the Hughes campaign is something we didn't really know until we started digging through the newspaper articles at the time and being like, wait, she served on that committee and this committee, and then looking up who Alice Carpenter was. So that was really an interesting component. And Greene's political views do shed a little bit of light on how she might have thought about race relations at that time. Considering especially the Morgans were Wilson supporters. Wilson was actually the president of Princeton when Greene worked there. So the fact that she were actively campaigning against him is interesting. And then this other campaign that she works on, she was chairman of the committee for the Lewis Carroll Children's Library. And so they had the Alice Fund when they were raising funds for building a children's library at this hospital. And Greene loved Alice in Wonderland. She actually tried to buy an original manuscript for the Morgan, that unfortunately the dealer sold out from under her in order for it to stay at the British Library because it is a national treasure in England. But she really wanted it. She was going to buy it with her personal money because she had this large amount of wealth to gift to the Morgan. That's how much she loved Alice in Wonderland. But so she does do this charity work with the Alice Fund. We know that she worked with the Henry Street Settlement in downtown Manhattan, which is still an organization today with visiting nurses to bring nursing services to lower income homeless populations. She worked with them. So as we parse through newspaper articles, we learn a little bit more and more about this work that unfortunately she didn't document for herself. So we have to use these newspaper articles to kind of shed light on these events that she did. Greene was also an avid art collector and book collector, not just for the Morgan, but for herself. So these are just 3 of many items that we have in the Morgan's collection today that shed light on her personal collecting. And this great quote from one of her friends and book dealer, Sydney Cockrell, about visiting her home full of beautiful things on 38th Street. And so these are just amazing and really are very different from each other. One of the things Greene was really interested in was Persian manuscripts. She tried to collect them for the Morgan. We do have some, but Jack wasn't just that into them. So she collected them for herself, and she has these beautiful ones that when she passed away, they came to the Morgan. And then I shift gears a little bit. Greene was director during some really tumultuous times in American history, and we learn a lot about American history through the work that Greene did. She was director through both of the world wars, as well as the Great Depression. And World War II was especially difficult for the Morgan Library. Most of our staff does leave to serve in the war. This letter on the screen is from one of those mentees that I mentioned, Helen M. Frank, who has this beautiful letter about how she remembers visiting the Morgan when she was in high school and then getting to work there. But now, those things have to be put aside because you have to go serve in the war. When Helen returns, Greene will write her a great recommendation letter, and she'll get another job in DC, and they stay friends throughout their life. And then we have this amazing story of this wonderful woman, Edith Parada, who was on the other end of the war. She comes here in 1938, just escaping out of as the Nazis are gaining control in Germany. Unfortunately, her some of her family does not get out. But during the around the 1940s, the worst of the war, Greene gives her a job, gives a chance on this, young woman as she's new in her career to catalog our cylinder seal collection, which is still housed in the North Room today, which was Greene's office. So they worked very closely together. But Edith Prada wrote these amazing letters talking about that the work she did at the Morgan for Greene was a way for her to stay grounded, to stay sane during the war years, not, you know, how to get her thoughts off of what was happening to her friends and family in Europe. Thankfully, her family does survive, everything's okay, but it's just the kind of the power of what, you know, Greene gave to this young woman at the time. And Prada will actually later in life become a honorary curator at the Morgan and has an amazing career with the cylinder seals, and actually will train our current curator of that department, Sydney Babcock, who knew her when he first started in the field. So this legacy of mentorship continued way past Greene. We have Greene she arranged for the collection of books to be donated to the Library of Louvain, which was destroyed in both World War I and World War II. Both times she organized raising funds to fix this. We have many letters of her writing to people in Europe, asking them, you know, are you okay? Like all of the dealer networks and scholars that she knew a ton of Jewish scholars in Germany, asking them, did they get out? Do they need help? What can she do for them? And then this letter on the screen, we have this amazing letter from a gentleman by the name of Ernest T. DeWalt, who's one of the monument men. So one of our historians and scholars who went over to Europe to try to protect the art from the Nazis during World War II. And in this letter, the red underlines is where he's talking about how their mission that day had been stopped because the Nazis were invading, moving closer to the front. And he's afraid that these treasures are going to be lost forever. And it's just a powerful statement. And then he ends the letter wishing that he could just be back in Manhattan with her drinking a martini or a highball. So now we know that she drank martinis and highballs. And it's just a beautiful image and sad. And they have this amazing friend. They do maintain a friendship. He introduced her to, they have a friend at one of the abbeys in Italy, Monte Cassino, which actually gets destroyed during World War II. But thankfully, I always get confused of what the father there, he survives, he gets out in time and is safe, which is great news to hear. And we do actually have one of our manuscripts is from the Abbey of Monte Cassino. So it really she had many connections to World War II that were really tough, and all during, you know, just the general war stuff. In 1938, she loses her mother. In 1943, she loses Jack Morgan. In the same time period, she loses Father Henry Havernat, who was from the Catholic University in Washington, D.C., who had cataloged our Coptic manuscripts, but became a really close friend of Greene's. Almost, she saw him as a father figure. There is over 600 letters between them at Catholic University, many of them handwritten, just talking about the manuscripts, talking about life. She brought her nephew, she brought her brother to visit him. We know that she loved his maid's fried chicken. She couldn't wait to get back to have it. So they had an amazing relationship, and so she lost him. But probably most devastating was the death of her nephew, Robert Mackenzie, known as Bobby Leverage, in 1943 in the war. Greene was his adopted mother. She will adopt him when he's an infant. She will pay for all of his schooling. He lives with her, goes off to boarding school. She takes him on all these European trips. And so this death really hit her really hard. And on the letter, we have an autographed manuscript from who was the Librarian of Congress at the time, Archibald MacLeish, the Young Dead Soldiers, which she asks him to send her because she wants to frame this poem next to an image of Bobby that she's going to keep in her apartment. So around this time, you know, she has all of these deaths. She starts getting, she's always been kind of plagued with different illnesses, but at this point, she really starts getting really sick. And unfortunately, she has to start scaling back her duties at the Morgan. But her mentees that she had so well trained, she knew could handle it. So she starts coming in a little bit less and less, but she still has time to make room for these important acquisitions up until the very end. And so these are some of her last acquisitions. One is a letter from from Frederick Douglass to J.D. Husbands. But what's really interesting about her acquisition of this letter is, one, she didn't collect Americana. That was really Pierpont's thing. He collected the Americana. Most of our Americana material comes in the early days of the Morgan. Towards the later half, we didn't really collect it. Frederick Douglass was, I don't want to say frenemy of Richard T. Greener's, but they didn't always agree. They definitely had opposing views sometimes, but they were contemporaries of each other and did have a relationship, which Greene most likely knew. But what's also amazing is what this letter talks about. And it's Douglass talking about how, you know, he wants to be seen not for just the color of his skin, but for the work he did, which Greene was always asking to be seen as a librarian. She's quoted as saying, "I'm just a librarian," and she advocated for being seen that way. So this letter, you know, has many different levels that it can be read on that she acquired. And then we have the Zerganalia Gospels from Ethiopia, which is her actual final acquisition that she made. The fact that it's a non-Western material says a lot about her thought process about materials at this time, that they didn't all have to be Western European. It didn't have to be from France, England to be valuable. She did see the value in all of the world's literature, which again was not always seen at this time. And this was a piece that was commissioned by a female ruler in Ethiopia. So there's this wonderful connection of Greene buying this item that was commissioned by a female ruler who believed that her only way her society would thrive would be through art and literature and culture. And then this is the last known photo of Greene. It's actually taken in the West Room of the Morgan, which was J.P. Morgan and Jack Morgan's office. And she's sitting at their desk because in 1948, she retires, and we hire a new director, Frederick Adams, who's now using the North Room. So where is she going to work? Well, she took the Morgan's desk. And so she's here looking at her second to last acquisition, which there is a leaf on the screen that from the Anhalt Gospels. One of our curators, Josh, was amazing and somehow figured out that the manuscript on the desk was this manuscript. I don't know how he did it. It's amazing. Our curators just do an amazing job. But so she's overviewing one of her last manuscripts that she acquired. And so in 1948, she retires. In 1949, the Morgan will put on a retrospective exhibition of some of the most amazing acquisitions she's made. There's over 100 items in this acquisition. And so she will get to hear all of the praise and love for her through speeches at the opening. And then in 1950, she unfortunately passes away from cancer. And so there ends Greene's life, but her legacy lived on in those at the Morgan who would often write letters to Bernard Berenson saying how they were still working for Belle Greene on a specific project, or, oh, I gotta go get that for Greene. Oh, wait, she's not here. Meta Harson, Kurt Bueller, two of the curators after she passes away, really pushed forward her legacy and her hopes and dreams for the institution, along with a woman named Felice Stanfill, who would become our drawings curator. And that passion and love for the institution is still something that is, you know, done by the staff today. And that is a very not so brief, somewhat brief, went really over. I apologize about Belle Greene, and I probably left out 20 million things, but I invite anyone, if you are in the New York area in October 2024, October, November, December, January, October 2024, come see the exhibition where we will have many of these treasures on display, going into more detail of life. Also, feel free to reach out to me at the Morgan with any questions. If you have any questions now, we'll try to answer. Again, I see I went over. I apologize. I can't stop talking about Greene, but I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
Erica, that was fabulous. Thank you. Thank you. I have some questions, but I will let other people, if you have a question, please type it in the chat, or I'll try to keep track if you want to raise your hand. That was really excellent. Thank you. Is there a lot of information about her funeral?
So
Was it a big event?
It was heavily attended. I'm blanking on the church right now, but we do have it all documented. And there's a really wonderful letter from Meta Harson, the curator who takes on her position after her, or the illuminated manuscript curator, who's one of her best friends, writes to Bernard Berenson discussing the funeral events. And actually the last days of her life. So we know that Meta Harson and Dorothy Minor were by her bedside. They took turns. And then the funeral was really, really well attended by many of the scholars, professors, other directors, all came to her funeral.
We have a question here. When will tickets for the exhibit go on sale, do you think?
I don't know if they're like how far in advance they will go. Probably not too far. I think you can buy tickets now like a month in advance. I think, and that's just for the whole entire museum. So like one ticket gets you into the whole institution.
Oh, okay.
And as of right now, we're still doing reserved tickets in order to get in. You can't just show up. But that's still COVID protocol. What it'll be like in 2024, I honestly have no idea, but we will make sure the website always stays up to date, which is just the morganlibrary.org. And so, yeah. And I see the exhibit 2023 or 2024. It's 2024 October. It opens late October 2024. I don't know the exact date yet. They're still finalizing the exhibition calendar.
Yeah, well, you have some lead time there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have, and someone did ask if you would mind sharing your email?
Oh, yeah, sure. I will put that in the chat.
Okay. All right. Yeah. And another question, please comment on the portrait hanging on the wall in what had been JP Morgan's office that Belle used after retiring.
Okay, yeah, so that's Tinto. I really cannot say any of these names. It's really bad. This is why, because I'm not an art historian. But it's Tintoretto's Portrait of a Man. And that was purchased by Jack Morgan in 1922, and it just always hung there. That's where he put it, and that's where it put. I know that it's mentioned in the book. Greene, as far as we know, Greene didn't really have a relationship to the portrait, didn't say anything about it, besides the fact that it was owned by Jack. And when he died in 1943, even though it was always in the library, it was his personal painting. It wasn't the library's acquisition. And when he died, it transferred from his estate to the Morgan and just came into our collections.
I see. What's your favorite acquisition of hers?
The Zerganalia Gospels, the very last acquisition she made, because she made a lot of acquisitions of female writers and female commissioners, which is, again, just fascinating. At the time, it wasn't really done. But that one just being from Ethiopia, and the story of the woman Zerganalia, who commissioned it, and how she thought about her people and how literature was so important to them, I just think is beautiful. And the pictures don't do it justice. It is a gorgeous manuscript. So if you can come for the exhibit, it will be on display, because I was like, we have to put it in the show. It's just absolutely amazing.
I'll take the next two chronologically. Can you share a little about what Belle said about JP Morgan in her letter with the black border?
So she was talking about just about like his funeral, how they set up the space, how they were setting up for the funeral, how who would be attending, and just the flowers that they ordered, which we do have preserved flowers from it. And she kept an entire scrapbook of all of the remembrances that were coming in. So it's a very weird, like you would think it'd be really emotional, but she's like kind of going through, like keeping herself calm, like, okay, I have to, we're getting these things together for the funeral. We set up the room to look like this, how he would have liked it on Christmas Day, and all these kind of things. So it's almost very matter of fact, but at the same time, you can sense that she's grieving and just trying to maintain that composure while she's writing to Berenson.
Right, that's ever the event planner there.
Yeah.
And another question was, what this Bobby, who she adopted?
Oh, so Bobby is, I probably should have said all that. So Bobby was her youngest sister Theodora's son, and his father actually dies in World War I. So yeah, he dies in World War I. He dies in World War II. It's very but so Theodore wanted to give him, you know, a better life, better schooling and all that kind of stuff. And Greene had the means to do that. She actually inherited, Pierpont Morgan left much of the staff's money when he died in 1913. So she actually got 50,000 plus from his estate plus her incredible pay. So she was capable of helping to pay for all of Bobby's schooling and things like that. So that's how she will end up adopting Bobby, is because Theodore is really going through, you know, losing her husband is extremely difficult. She will remarry and have another child who actually she names after Belle Greene, who is Belle Greene Harvey, which is just like, ah.
Are there any descendants of the any relatives who've been in, you know, of hers who have been involved at the library or are part of the
We're still working with reaching out to descendants because we don't know how much of their history they want to share. The only descendants would be through Belle Greene Harvey. At this time, we don't know if her brother Russell had any children, and we've not been able to accurately say whether her sister Louisa had any children. We don't know if Louisa marries a man, Frederick Martin, who was actually started the Ithaca School for Speech Therapy, which is still in operation today. And we do know he was white. We don't know if he knew his wife was Black. That information has not come to light. I do know there's a blog written up by the school. They call her Black because they know now because she's related to Belle Greene, but that we have no knowledge of whether Frederick Martin knew. And there is reports that there were two children, but it's whether or not they were from Louisa or his second wife, we're not sure. So the only guaranteed family we know is Theodore's one child, Belle Greene Harvey, did have children, and there are alive descendants of that today, which we are still working with, you know, communicating with them, and, you know, just whatever they want is what we are willing to, you know, it's all what they want to do. We will never pressure anyone or be like, oh, let us know anything, you know, it's how they want to handle their family history. And we just want to be sensitive of that.
Yeah, it's nice. But what do you think is the big takeaway from her story, or what would you want everyone to remember about her?
She was a librarian. It's very important, you know, it's wonderful that we have these fiction works about her, because there's also, so there's the personal librarian, there was a novel published in France that has been translated into English, Belle Greene. We know that the personal librarian got optioned. It'll probably get turned into a movie. But for me, it's just, what were her words? What did she want to say? And she did say so much, even though we don't have those big glaring, like, we want to know about these things in her life. We have so much more. She said, I want to be seen as a librarian. And she was an amazing librarian who, just at a time when women didn't hold that role, to get paid what she got paid, to get the respect that she got, is just incredible. And it's just like, your passions can get you where you want to go if you're willing to go that route. And it's really just kind of amazing. And she was willing to share that with so many people and really form this family, because so much of the passing narrative is you lose everything. She kept her family, her immediate family, and she had this Morgan family. She was known to spend time with all of the children of staff. She would roll out the cylinder seals for them. We think of also the Morgan being so elite and so fancy. And like, I now imagine it with children running around and just so lively. And it's just really just kind of, you know, just remembering what she wanted, which was for this amazing collection to be used and loved and to spread knowledge. I think is just really amazing.
Yeah. Two more questions. Yeah. Would you consider the LaPierre book a novel or a biography?
It is a work of fiction. It is a work. There is only one biography written on Belle Greene, and it's called An Illuminated Life by Heidi Artazonen. That is the only biography out there. Any other work is a work of historical fiction. Yeah.
Didn't you tell me that book, The Illuminated Life, a lot of it was based on letters she wrote to Berenson?
Yeah, so The Illuminated Life was because at the time that was the biggest trove of letters that was known, because Heidi's book comes out around 2003, when she was doing her research was 2003. So I think it came out like 2005, 2006. So like the facts about Greene going to Northfield for school, we didn't know that yet. That research hadn't been done and wasn't done until Daria from the Morgan had done it. So like some of those facts aren't in the book, but it's still the most complete, accurate, as close as you can get right now to a published work about Greene.
And that's the author who discovered her birth certificate.
No, that's Jean Strauss.
Oh, I'm sorry.
She wrote the biography of Morgan and just has a chapter on Greene, but then she did do a New York Times article that I believe if you search Jean Strauss, Belle da Costa Greene New York Times article, it does come up because I remember I found it before.
Right. And then, another one came through.
About the copying.
As far as you know, did she actually have an abortion in real life?
We do not know that. The quote that comes from is from that's from Heidi's biography. The letter that she quotes does not account for the top part of the letter, where she's talking about the birth of Bobby and how, you know, seeing Bobby being born, and then she's kind of wishing, oh, maybe I should have had kids. And then you have this other line that makes you wonder. We don't know. We honestly don't know. She could have, she could not. I'm not going to get into a woman's decision to make that decision. If she did, she did. If she didn't, she didn't. Not my business. But we honestly just really, that we don't have anything else that says anything. The only other like strong Heidi's thing is that like we know she was given a liver pill while she's in Europe and being treated for sickness. At the time, liver pills were used for abortions. However, they're also used for things like anemia.
Yeah,
and
which was very common.
African-Americans have a high case of anemia. So like we really, it was used for so many conditions, and Greene had chronic sickness. She did have a stroke in her life. Like I said, she died of cancer. So, I mean, it really, we just can't say whether or not she did or didn't.
Oh, and here's a message for everyone that there are a couple videos online with Jean Strauss talking about her work. That would be fun to follow up on.
Yeah, Jean Strauss is amazing. I mean, the book on Morgan, I mean, for being about financial history is actually really interesting.
Yeah, I know it was very well reviewed when it came out. We have a question. I bet this is a curator. How would manuscripts be copied at the time during her life?
It's called a facsimile, which is literally like reprinting the work on similar type of paper. You really almost can't tell the difference between the two. I don't understand the process of making facsimiles. It's a lot of work. We a lot of money to make them. We did do it. We shipped it out. We used Kodak because we have the receipt bills for our facsimiles. But so that's what they were called. And like I said, that's as much of the process of what I understand a facsimile to be. But it is different from like a reproduction, which is just like a color scan or a color photo of it. It has the weight and feel of the actual manuscript.
Yeah, interesting. Well, Erica, I can't thank you enough. Your passion for the topic really comes through. Let's give her a round of applause, everyone.
Well, thank you everyone for listening to me talk for so long. Like I said, and I feel wonderful. Like I only scratched the surface with Greene. So really, I'm happy to answer anyone's questions. Reach out to me anytime. I have an Instagram. Half the time, all my Instagram posts are photos I take of Belle Greene stuff at the library. So feel free to follow me.
How can they follow? How can they follow you on Instagram?
Hold on, I'm gonna look up my thing and put it in the chat.
Okay.
I also post really other random things, so it might not be something you want to do, but I will put it here. So because I do post fun things that I find in the archive if you so choose to check it out. So that's my Instagram name. Feel free. To see what we've got. And don't forget to be a member of the National Collaborative Women's History Sites and donate if you can and support. It's a great organization that really is doing amazing work to keep, women's history alive and in the sites where they belong to be told, which is everywhere.
Yes, bravo, bravo. Thank you. Thanks again, Erica. And thank you to everyone for coming tonight. Please do visit the website. That's National Collaborative for Women's History Sites. Leave a donation to support this and more programs like this. And we hope to see you in the next 3 months with another evening program. Thanks again for joining us tonight. Good night.
Thank you.